Your rules and your religion, all designed to keep you safe.
In an industry like professional wrestling, and especially the WWE, it's all about the big spotlight and the bright lights. When we talk about WWE, we often talk about the superstars, the big executives, or at a stretch, some of the few people working right behind the scenes in the gorilla position area. We're talking about backstage producers. But how much do we even talk about them anyway? It's been brought up time and time again, and most fans are aware that with a company as massive as WWE, there are many people working tirelessly behind the scenes that we know nothing about. Think of people driving WWE's big trucks from town to town across North America. Think about the people setting up the ring, doing the superstars' costumes and makeup, the catering team, the ones setting the stages, the men and women in the office at Stanford. We can keep going on and on. While we often credit the people on the camera, we rarely give props to the majority that grind backstage to make WWE what it is. With the man who this video is about, it's a bit of a confusing contradiction. Jim Johnston is highly regarded by anyone who knows his name, anyone who grew up watching WWE between the mid-1980s and mid-2000s. At the same time, Jim Johnston still feels underrated and unappreciated.
You think you know all the wrestling stories? There's more you haven't heard yet. Join us on Backstage Pass.
Jim Johnston is the man behind the soundtracks of many of your childhoods, and he's a wrestling icon. Just think about it. Theme songs of guys like Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Vince McMahon, Brock Lesnar, The Undertaker, Mankind, The Ultimate Warrior, and Generation X were all masterminded by this man. For 32 years, he worked for WWE and produced some of the most well-known music in history. He composed over 10,000 songs in that time. So who is Jim Johnston, and why is he the unsung hero of WWE's music and maybe even WWE in general? Growing up in Pocahontas, Arkansas, Jim Johnston came from humble beginnings. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but his father hated life in the city and took his children to live the simple life in rural northeast Arkansas, the place he came from. His grandmother played the organ at the Methodist church in town, and his father often had a record player on. Johnston actually took piano lessons and didn't find it to be a good fit, so he called it quits. Jim Johnston had an ear for music like many people do, but there was one pivotal moment. His parents had taken Jim and his siblings to an amusement park of sorts, and he heard some music playing. He tried dragging his parents to see them, but they were uninterested. He described the band he saw as being very Beatles-esque, and it was like a drug, and it was all he needed to hear to know he was going to pursue music. He ended up renting a guitar for a year and started teaching himself. He finally convinced his father to buy a supposedly horrible acoustic guitar, and his love for music just expanded from there. Jim Johnston wanted to pursue music, but his father wasn't having it. His family moved to New York to have access to a lot of different opportunities. At the time, the chances of making a living in the music industry were slim, so he ended up working his way to become an architect. He even went as far as getting accepted into Harvard's School of Architecture, but he had a change of heart. His father wasn't exactly happy about it, but he couldn't stop his son's destiny. He fell into the trap of thinking he would work during the day and work on his music at night. Jim Johnston worked as a carpenter to support himself and still managed to rise the ranks of the music industry. He managed to get gigs with HBO, Showtime, and other major broadcast networks, and it took him to Connecticut. His favorite food at the time was sushi, and there was only one place that served it, a Japanese restaurant. Sushi might be one of the most popular things to eat in the world today, but back then it was still pretty niche. Because of that, Jim Johnston ran into the same people every time, and one guy asked him about his music career. That guy was WWE's art director back then, Brian Penry. Penry said he was putting together a video to show in a broadcast television convention and had no idea how to fit the music in, so it gave Jim Johnston his first unofficial assignment with WWE. Penry managed to convince Vince McMahon to give him a chance, and Johnston and Vince hit it off right away. One of his first official assignments was WrestleMania 1, the high-pitched saxophone instrumental. Johnston said that when he heard that theme for the first time in an arena and heard people reacting to it, it was the closest he felt to the high that musicians feel when performing live on stage. Back then, there was no entrance music for superstars. The only two examples off the top of our heads of wrestlers who had theme songs were the legendary Gorgeous George, who we covered in a different video, and Mildred Burke. Vince McMahon told his father before he purchased the WWE from him that he wanted to put entrance music in. His father, in a prediction that aged like milk, said that putting entrance music would kill the business. Initially, neither Jim Johnston nor Vince McMahon had any concrete major plan to give every wrestler a theme song. It was a slow, organic process that began with songs for their broadcast TV shows and then for a couple of superstars. Once it started working, they began to slowly give theme songs to superstars, but at first, only good guys were getting theme songs. This was the first time that Jim Johnston felt he needed to push back at Vince McMahon because he didn't agree with the idea that bad guys shouldn't have theme songs. Eventually, his idea won over and even bad guys started to get cool entrance music. Believe it or not, Vince McMahon and Jim Johnston worked on a handshake agreement for the longest time. It wasn't until WWE went public in October 1999 that Jim Johnston got into a contract. Once the lawyers got involved, they were shocked to learn that the guy who created the best music WWE ever produced could just walk away and work for another company at any point. But the relationship that Vince McMahon and Jim Johnston shared was an interesting one. Johnston told Newsweek that his conversations with the most powerful man in wrestling history rarely had to do with music. More often than not, Vince McMahon would give him bullet points about a certain superstar, and Johnston worked with what he was given. He once said that McMahon had a reputation for being a hard ass because he was rarely creatively surprised. Johnston was one of the few people who seemed to impress Vince on the regular. But make no mistake about it, when Vince didn't like what he heard, he would let Johnston know. It's quite incredible to read and listen to the thought process behind the music he made for the greatest legends. Let's take, for example, one of Jim Johnston's personal favorite works of his, Stone Cold Steve Austin's theme song. Stone Cold was always appreciative of his work and let Johnston know that he needed a song that let everyone know that chaos and disaster were coming. Johnston picked up his guitar and started strumming what became the riff to one of the greatest theme songs in wrestling history. He first had the idea of the intro starting with a car crash and then moved to the idea of glass shattering. When he found out that the noise of a glass shattering was too thin, he added the car crash to it. After taking just 20 minutes to make the song, he recorded the first version of it just 8 hours later. He wasn't normally that quick with making music, but he knew it fit the character of a superstar who walked in, raised hell, and left. It was meant to represent the anti-authority persona of Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was a lightning in a bottle type moment. On the opposite end, when he made Mr. McMahon's theme song, it was meant to represent the immovable authority of the man himself. The funny part about that is when he was making McMahon's theme song, he was actually annoyed with his boss about something at work. He thought to himself, quote, "You've got no chance against this guy," end quote, the ultimate authority of the professional wrestling / sports entertainment industry. He had already written the guitar riff for the song and found himself singing, "No chance, no chance in hell" over it, and that was what created another iconic theme. To Johnston, it wasn't a song about one man, it was a song about the man. The man who operates an entire industry and the people in it like a puppet master and creates a system that imprisons human beings. And to think that the freaking song was made about his own boss. In Johnston's own words, Vince McMahon let him take risks. To him, creating the theme of Degeneration X was a risk. It was a risk because it went against the grain of the time, which was a chaotic, earth-shattering entrance. If you think of the DX theme song, you'll recall that it starts slow with a guitar groove and mild beats of the drum. The incredible singer Chris Warren would blurt phrases, "You think you can tell us what to do? You think you can tell us what to wear? You think you're better?" before it picks up. To Jim Johnston, the intro was meant to represent a confrontational characteristic that every member of DX shared. He even wrote down tons of phrases before it came down to, "You think you can tell us what to do?" and the ones that made the final cut. Even though the song has been compared to Rage Against the Machine, Johnston considers it to be more of a funk groove type of song, even though Rage considers themselves the renegades of funk. When it came to The Rock's theme song, Jim Johnston told Vice that his idea was to create an entrance that would make people scream about The Rock appearing in front of them. Johnston wasn't sure if he wanted to make the theme song rock, rap, or even orchestral, so he smashed everything together because, in his own words, The Rock is his own genre. The Rock left a real impression on Johnston as a human being, and the guitar solo in his song was meant to represent his unshakable confidence and swagger. The Undertaker is one legend who has been vocal about the importance of entrance music. To him, it sets the table for what's about to happen in the ring. For the Phenom, the sound of the gong meant it was go time. The thought process that went into this theme song is absolutely incredible. Johnston had the idea of a song that represented what you hear in funerals with church bells and organs. It was meant to convey emotions of tragedy and sadness. To Jim Johnston, the work of making music was as much of a psychological undertaking as it was a musical one. He used his childhood trauma of being a middle child in his family and always feeling invisible. Honing in on that, he made the song an extension of his personal struggles as well as the darkness of The Undertaker's character. According to Johnston, The Undertaker was always a character who made it okay to think about difficult subjects like death and afterlife. Jim Johnston told YouTuber Albert Janauer that when you break it down, it begins like a nursery rhyme before adding the ominous effects of rain and thunder, all while the gong keeps going. The climax was directly adopted from a piano sonata named Pesante e Sostenuto, a simple track. But Johnston told Albert Janauer that while the greatest melodies in history are simple, there's nothing more difficult to do than simple. The simplicity of it all turned the song into what it eventually became and played a big part in who The Undertaker eventually became. Can you imagine The Undertaker having the same level of impact without the aura and mysticism of his entrance theme? Johnston was gradually getting phased out in the 2010s, but not before he created some absolute bangers. Randy Orton's theme song Voices was a collaboration between Jim Johnston and Rev Theory, and as of this year, courtesy of Lion France, audiences are singing it and adding another layer of aura to Randy Orton. But in 2017, that story came to an end. Johnston admitted on the RRBG podcast a few years ago that to some degree, it was time for him to go, but that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It felt like a divorce after being consumed by a 3-decade-long relationship. Vince McMahon ended up calling him and letting him know that they weren't renewing his contract, putting an end to an iconic partnership. According to Johnston, he was a victim of backstage politics and an unnamed person worked for years to get him fired and finally succeeded. The pronounced difference between Jim Johnston and his successors was that he felt like the success of the superstars in WWE were in his hands. That's a massive responsibility, and it reflected in the outcome of the music he produced. In the eyes of many, WWE's theme songs feel more generalized, more corporate, and less authentic. It's hard to argue with anyone on that because there aren't many superstars with memorable theme songs anymore. Think of the glass-shattering, the If You Smell, the car screech, the gongs, and the theme songs of the greatest legends in WWE history. Their theme songs were part of who they were. They're so timeless that even decades after they were created, they generate a reaction that gets people off their feet, still gets people excited, and it plays a direct role in connecting superstars to fans. When Jim Johnston spoke to Conrad Thompson, he straight up said that modern wrestling themes don't generate any emotions. To him, music is about making people feel something.
I remember my road trip to my first WrestleMania. My buddy and I listened to wrestling themes. Yeah, we listen to the regular radio, but every now and again we just turn on wrestling themes. And that's so silly that if you're outside of our sort of wrestling bubble, you don't really get that.
What he said summed it up best. The music of many superstars doesn't feel like it has anything to do with the character. Putting hard-hitting drums doesn't make them feel badass. Once again, think of the greatest legends in WWE history from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Their theme song perfectly fit their character, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. In a weird way, it kind of represents the climate of the real world. Things feel like they're getting increasingly corporatized, increasingly homogenous, and lacking in character and depth. The entire premise behind professional wrestling is for it to be an escape from the real world. So when fans get frustrated at the lack of memorable theme songs, it's important to remember that things like these are in the back of their minds, even if they don't realize it. But there's also the argument to be made that wrestling has always been a reflection of society at the time. It's hard not to feel for Jim Johnston when he gave his life and soul to WWE. He is without a doubt one of the most important non-wrestlers in WWE history. In cinema, some of the all-time great directors had their fixed composers who they kept associating with throughout their career. Italy's Federico Fellini had Nino Rota, the man who went on to write the theme for The Godfather. Japan's Akira Kurosawa had Fumio Hayasaka, George Lucas had John Williams, Christopher Nolan had Hans Zimmer, and the list goes on. To some, it might be laughable to compare Jim Johnston to such musical greats, but he was to WWE what all those legendary composers were to the greatest directors. It could be argued that wrestling songs don't really work outside of wrestling, but does that even matter? It was largely because of this one man, Jim Johnston, that the greatest reactions in WWE history were produced. Hopefully, one day his achievements will be recognized and celebrated in the WWE Hall of Fame. Until then, he's enjoyed nearly a decade of not having to work under pressure and deadlines and focus on music that he enjoys. Thank you, Jim Johnston.